Okay, looking at Struggle of Nations. This is Kevin Zucker's Avalon Hill game on the, as you can see, Napoleon's Spring and Autumn campaigns in Saxony in 1813. This is a game that has been, I would argue, now having actually read through all the rules, probably unfairly maligned as having a terrible rule book. The rules are not great for learning this particular system. I think if you want to learn this system, I would recommend playing Napoleon at Bay, which is hiding down there, which I just recently did some video on already, so you may have seen those. Realizing that this is part of the same system, I opted to push ahead and give this a try, despite all the people saying, oh my god, the rules are a mess. My experience is the rules are very similar to Napoleon at Bay. There are some differences. This, I believe, predated the Avalon Hill Napoleon at Bay, but not Zucker's first printing of Napoleon at Bay, which I want to say was like late 70s, maybe 1977-ish or thereabouts. Struggle of Nations was from 1981. I think Napoleon at Bay, the Avalon Hill version, which you can see that's not the Avalon Hill version, that's the OSG. It's Zucker's company, operational studies group. That was his 1997 version. So a later printing, and then I was playing with the 2019 Napoleon at Bay upgrade kit, or expansion kit, which basically replaced all the counters from the 1997, or I think it replaces the counters and stuff from any previous version and a number of charts. But the rule set also replaced the 1997 rules, and I would argue, I think these rules are better than the rules in the 1997 Napoleon at Bay. Now that, may be a controversial opinion, but I was having a very difficult time reading the original rules to the 1997 Napoleon at Bay. And when I bought the 2019, and just to give some clarity on that, the expansion kit, I'm talking about this, the Napoleon at Bay expansion kit. This was published in 2019. It has a new rule book in there, all new counters for the game, and some new charts. I believe it's just the army charts and not the org charts. I think the org charts are the same from whatever version of the game that you have. But the rules that were in here are very good, I think. They were certainly better than the original rules that came with that version. And I think even these rules are better than the 1997 Napoleon at Bay rules. Just, I think, in terms of organization, the one disadvantage that these rules have, and they are substantial, you're looking at 46 pages, so almost 50 pages of rules in here. They do not need to be that long. The big issue with these is that things are described with lots of words. I was watching the movie Amadeus recently, where Jeffrey Jones's Emperor of Austria famously says, too many notes, and it's the case here with these rules for Struggle of Nations. I think for the system, too many words. The Napoleon at Bay expansion kit refined everything down to a pretty low number of words. So I think this could have benefited from that and didn't. That being said, having read the Napoleon at Bay expansion kit revised system rules and then reading these rules, it was like, yeah, I feel like I'm reading the same thing, just a lot more loquacious. So it was not difficult for me to pick up the system. All the things, just about all the things are the same. The big difference here, obviously, is the scale and dealing with the tiny, tiny hexes. And I'm going to get closer to the map here. It's going to be tough to do it without glare because my lights are right overhead. But these hexes are very tiny. These are, a normal game, a hex is probably going to be about that big. There's 6 or 7 hexes in, per normal hex size for most games. So you're dealing with, and then as a result, to have playable size pieces, these are all 2 hexes long, which creates the difficulties that every game has that utilizes double hex size units. So here I'm thinking of Musket and Pike, the Musket and Pike series, where you have the double hex units, or certain hex units in like the phalanx units in Great Battles of History. It creates a whole pile of rules specifically around those double hexes. And so for this game, all of the movement and combat that you're doing on the map is going to be subject to those 2 hex rules, because the units that you're dealing with are all 2 hex sized units. So and when I say units, I really mean armies. You're dealing with forces here. These are all forces. Your actual units are all normal size counters over here on the army display charts. And so the result there is that you have your weird sized units here. Let's say center of operations. But you have your weird sized units here that take up 2 hexes that have to deal with all that when they're in combat and stuff like that. All these normal sized counters over here do is just track your strength on your various army lists. So, but again, I will say, if you want to learn this operational level system, I would recommend getting Napoleon at Bay and the expansion kit from 2019. Those 2019 revised rules streamlined some things and made some changes. The biggest change, maybe not the biggest, but one of the more noticeable changes between that system, that version of the system, and this one is this thing is, well, first of all, in the attrition sequence. So here, and maybe pull out my, so the attrition sequence here, you have something, this thing here, the attrition quotient matrix, where you're essentially finding out how many administrative points you have, and then the size of your force, cross-referenced with the distance that you've marched for that particular turn, and then determining a number, which is your attrition quotient, and then you take that number and you bring it down here. So say you, in a march, you marched, so you've got 9 to 13, you're the Silesian army, and you've got between 9 and 13 administrative points, and you've got, say, a 8 strength point unit force, and you march them 5 spaces in a turn. That would be actually here, so you'd end up with a 1/8, because you're looking at the MPs expended during a march, not a forced march, but a march. 4 to 5, you are at, what did I say? 1/8, yep. You're at 1/8, so you take that 1/8 number, bring it down here, say the weather's fair, your attrition quotient is 1/8, so you're gonna roll a die on this column, and as you can see here, you need to roll, during fair weather, you would need to roll a 7 or higher, which is impossible to do unless you've got modifiers, so, because you're just rolling 1 die. So, the more recent versions of this system eliminate this whole quotient number, and they literally take this chart and then run out the number of strength points you actually lose just here. So you only have to do this calculation. You don't have to take whatever weird number you get here and bring it down here and do another calculation. It's all just done in this one chart. That's how the more recent version of the system does it, which makes a lot more sense to me. I don't know why you need that extra step in there. Another difference was in the here, this army support number. At the beginning of each player turn, a player must announce the level of support that he wishes to give his army by foregoing some or all of the APs that he would otherwise acquire in that turn. This doesn't exist in the newer versions of the system. I'm not sure why it exists here. I don't know if it's some representation of the scale of this particular game with the much larger scale of the map. I don't know, but these instructions don't make a whole lot of sense. Basically, you say, okay, I could get potentially 3 or more administrative points in my administrative point roll, and that's something that you do at the beginning of every turn. It is your administrative point pool, depending on how far away, and the other system has this too. The Napoleon Bay has this too. Based on your distance from your center of operation area of the distance of your center of operations from your supply source. So in this case, like the Prussian supply source is here, and their center of operations is all the way over here. That's more than 70 hexes away via road. You're going to be on the 80 chart here because you're more than 60 but less than 80, so you're going to be on the 80 chart. You're looking at the Silesian army in the spring, so you'd be on this column, and you can see here on a 1, 2, or 3 they'll get some points, otherwise they get nothing. So they can't even bet 3 points. And you can, and that, which is why these rules just don't make a whole lot of sense to me. You can say, yeah, I'm gonna allocate three points. Well, you can only get 2, but this says you can do however many you want. So when you roll it out and see what you get, if you get 0, it doesn't matter. You're not going to subtract 3 from your existing pool. Say I were to get 2, you would give up all 2 of those, but you would still get to be on the -3 column, except it says exception. A player can never shift 1 column to the left of the current unmodified column unless he has received at least 3 APs and subtracted those 3 APs from his AP total. So say you say, oh, I want to give 3 even though I can only give 2. Well, there's no point doing that because this says you can't. So you say, well, then I'll give 2. Well, say you roll a 0, which you're likely to do. This says you don't actually have to subtract anything if you got 0, but you still get the column of the shift that you would have chosen, meaning that you get no shift. So why you would ever choose less than 2 makes no sense to me, and how you would ever end up shifting to the right, I don't understand. So always commit at least 2. Doesn't matter what you roll over here because you get whatever you chose. So how these even apply, basically none of this made any sense at all to me, so I just ignored it. I'm not even using it in this game. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure what it adds to the game. It just adds more difficulty on your attrition, because now, say you're on this, I decided to support my army with nothing. So you would shift 2 columns to the right. Well, as the allies, you start off with very low administrative points and not much chance to get more. 2 to the right would put you almost on the worst possible column, and your attrition is going to be horrible. So it just seems like an extra step that adds nothing and is based in no sort of reality that I can possibly understand. The rules are terribly written. They don't make any sense, so I just decided to ignore it. The later system, the newer versions of the rules in the system don't have anything about this nonsense, so I just ignored it. So I'm not playing with that. I'm just playing the way I'm used to playing, which is just straight up however many administrative points you have at the time you're checking attrition is what determines your quotient and puts your number down here. So all these column shifts up here are just a bunch of nonsense. So those are the two key differences in the rules that I've noticed. Stuff about bridge destruction and things is a little bit different. In the current system, it uses movement points. Here, it's just a straight up die roll that seems to be not tied to movement at all. So anytime you move up next to a bridge, you can roll to see if you can destroy it and then keep moving or whatever you want to do. I didn't see anything in the rules that said you couldn't do that. So those are just some of the differences, but I don't believe otherwise. It all seems the same to me. You're spending administrative points to move guys. If you don't have the administrative points to spend, or you don't want to spend them, and your management of administrative points is basically the key to the whole game. It was that way for Napoleon at Bay, and it's that way here. So all of these 1X operational Zucker systems, it's all about managing your administrative points, because your administrative points, you want to get those built up as much as you can, because the lower they are, the worse your attrition is every time you move. So the side that's managing their administrative points much less effectively is killing their army just by marching them anywhere. So it's one of those keys, one of the keys to the game, this delicate balancing act of keeping your center of operations within, keeping your units within a dispatch distance of your center of operations in order to minimize attrition, and then you learning when to spend administrative points for a move versus using attrition for a move, or not attrition, using initiative for a move. So the initiative of units that you're moving, of your leaders is a big deal. Your lower initiative leaders are not going to be able to move as much. You're going to have to spend your administrative points to get those lower initiative leaders to move, whereas for your higher initiative leaders, you will gamble on them being able to use initiative. And so one of the brilliant parts of the system is that you have to do all of your administrative point moves before you can do initiative moves. So that forces you to commit. If you're going to commit to a guy that has a 4 initiative, you're like, hey, if he has a 4 initiative, I'm not going to burn a precious administrative point on him. I'm going to try and roll the dice and move him, and you need to roll a 4 or less, which can be modified depending on whether they have a bonus point, a star on their leadership, or I think there's other certain things that can impact it, like, I'm not sure if weather or morale, I need to look, hasn't been an issue yet so far, but weather or morale may affect initiative rolls. Yeah, morale affects initiative rolls. Just looking at this is a nice thing too. Not enough games have this summary of modifiers, where it literally just goes down through all the scenarios in which modifiers might apply. But like here, morale is added to an initiative die roll and your admin point receipt. So, and then changes, all this stuff is cool. Leader bonus point affects attrition in combat, things like that. It's a nice chart to have. But again, the brilliance of the system is juggling, balancing that use of administrative points versus stockpiling administrative points versus initiative. So if you rely too much on initiative on a turn because you want to marshal, conserve those precious administrative points, you might not be able to move very much. So you have to really be careful. For something, a move that you absolutely need to make, you're going to want to use administrative points for it. But sometimes that move you absolutely need to make happens during the enemy's turn, during the force march segment, which is basically, think of like a reaction phase in a turn sequence where, okay, you've moved all of your shit, and usually it's like in a World War II game, you moved all your shit, now the enemy has a chance to react to everything you've just done. Well, that's essentially what the force march sequence is. It comes technically in the combat phase of the turn. So once the active side has done their AP point movement and their initiative movement, then the opposing player gets to do his force march segment. The key about force march, though, is that it is all initiative. You cannot use administrative points to do a force march, which makes sense here, because you're talking about reaction, and aggressive, more brilliant, smarter commanders will be able to react i.e. higher initiative, and crappy commanders with lower initiative will not be able to react. And so that is another means of moving. And in this game, it's very important because if you're moving max movement points every phase, your attrition potential ramps up rapidly the more spaces that you move. If you move twice a turn, once during your active phase, movement phase, and then once during the force march phase that you can do during your opponent's combat turn, you're getting to move. I shouldn't say twice a turn. You're getting to move once every turn, even when it's not your turn. So if that makes sense, you can move once during your phase, and you can move once during your opponent's phase. But during your opponent's phase, you can only use initiative. So, and you're going to be on a slightly different initiative or attrition column on the force march turn, just because, again, it's kind of like an extra march, not the same as extended march, but essentially, stealing a march on your opponent. So those are important to use because if you use your force march properly, you can actually reduce the amount of attrition you're taking if you're moving just a few spaces in your movement phase and then a few spaces in a force march phase. Might end up taking less attrition. I say might because it still does come down to a die roll. Might take less attrition, maybe is likely to take less attrition than if you moved one huge block of movement points in one phase or the other. So, and I think the rules actually gave sort of a breakdown of that, where if you moved, the max distance you could in your normal movement phase, you'd have like 15% attrition, whereas if you moved a little bit in each movement phase and force march phase, you would take 5% in each of those, which would be less than that 15% total. So there's ways to marshal your movement much more carefully. So I have played through actually the first turn. I can advance my turn marker to the second turn, so we're up to the 27th and 28th of April. And the first turn was huge. Lots of stuff happened, and not nearly as much stuff would have happened had I not read this article in the General, which was the old Avalon Hill magazine. They had a whole issue devoted to this game. And there was this article here playing both sides of the Elbe. So, and this era of wargame, that Avalon Hill era and there's all the old Avalon Hill titles that I have, along with some SPI and Victory Games stuff. I actually have more Victory Games titles than I do Avalon Hill titles. But this era of wargaming, these games were, a lot of them, what I would say, balanced as games, as opposed to some types of war games which are unbalanced and more like historical studies. These felt more like games, although Zucker always put a lot of scholarship into his games. I mean, here's a guy who clearly loves the Napoleonic era, loves these battles, the supply and operational challenges of this era of combat. So I'm not knocking the scholarship, but these games can all be, and well, I mean, really any war game can, but for some reason it feels more typical of games of this era. I'm not sure why. Maybe because there's been more things like this written from games of this era, but there is an absolute min-max calculation that can be done for this game in particular. So this article, I read it, and I'm playing the spring scenario here, and that's all I'm going to play. I'm not going to do the whole campaign. So I'm playing the spring scenario here, and this article basically says, okay, this is what you have to do to have any chance as the French, of being successful in the spring scenario, and thus, by extension, really into the campaign. And this article basically says it all comes down to cavalry. The French don't have enough. The Allies have just enough. And it even says here, the French player must attach at least one strength point of cavalry to every distinct command if he hopes to bring the Allies to battle. He should attempt to put 2 SPs of cavalry in each frontline command. The most advanced force should have all the cavalry that can be spared. The Allied commander, while ensuring a 3-to-1 advantage to his rearguard leaders, should always try to free cavalry under cavalry major generals to blow bridges, cut lines of communication, and disrupt depots that are unoccupied. He has available some 20 strength points for this purpose. These are the most valuable 20 Allied strength points on the map board. So this essentially says it comes down to cavalry. If the Allies use their 20 strength points of cavalry correctly, they pretty much win. It even has this chart here that breaks down by scenario the percentage of cavalry of the total forces available, and it's the overall strength points, but of note is the balance of cavalry. Whereas in the spring scenario, I guess the French do outnumber the Allies, but they don't have as much cavalry, and that's what the Allies can use to win. And so it's reduced down to min-max, and then for the actual scenarios, it literally breaks down what the French need to do. The French have this number of men, and this number of men are entering. So they have the numbers, and then the French can choose 2 strategies. They can go after Berlin, or they can go immediately for Dresden. This says going after Berlin is pointless. You should go after Dresden, because Berlin will get you nothing in the end. It'll stretch you too far, and you won't be able to effectuate any real advantage from it except for a fleeting morale advantage. And so then it says, now that you've quote-unquote decided, because this literally told you there's no point in going to Berlin. So since you're not going to do that, here's what you must do. You must maximize your forces accordingly. So you got to base your guys, how the forces start out is incorrectly organized to maximize your mathematical advantages in the game. So you must consolidate, you must swap all these forces back and forth between leaders, create major generals to create independent cavalry commands, take one guy who was in charge and had a subordinate and flip them, and so the guy that was in charge is now subordinate to the guy who was originally subordinate, because the guy who was subordinate has a greater initiative. So swap these forces to these guys so that this guy with the higher initiative is in command of all these forces now. It is all, now none of any of this is based on history. That is all based on the math of the game. And so any of these command decisions you're making, none of this is historical. None of moving Force X to Commander Y and Force Z to Commander J is based on history at all. It is all based on maximizing the number of forces under the particular initiative leader in a particular position on the board that can move them to a particular position to mathematically outnumber and or effectuate the enemy's potential movements or potential reactions. Now, that is the essence of almost any war game. It comes down to force sizes and mathematical percentages of those force sizes as they relate to that game's particular CRT. But what this is, to me, is a math puzzle and not a historical simulation of what happened on a battlefield or in a theater of operations. It, in my opinion, and some people who I call the giant math brains type gamers, it's a gamer type, live for this. They live for the mathematical optimization puzzle. That's why they play these games, because they have maximized the percentage success of a force to bring to bear with the most mathematical percentage of certainty of success on a particular point on the battlefield. That's what they've done. But that level of precision did not exist in reality historically. The general odds may have existed historically of, okay, yes, I need to supply my forces with, X number of victuals to feed this many guys, and if I bring this many guys to this point on the map, I have good odds of success. I do not have precise odds of success, and that is generally what war games, the mathematical optimization in war games can provide you. Oh, I'm on that 4-1 on the CRT. It's gonna be guaranteed success. If I was at 3-1, not guaranteed success, therefore I'm not gonna do it. It's everything that I hate about wargaming, which is funny because, like I said, it is almost the essence of wargaming, but I hate it. I love just moving shit around, understanding the general concepts of the system, and understanding where my odds are generally gonna be good, but this hyperactive manipulation of forces on these force charts of, especially because they're set up a certain way, and that article basically says, yeah, they're set up like shit. You need to rejigger everything because it's not nearly optimized, and that just drives me bonkers. This idea that no, it's not optimized, and historically, would this commander have subordinated to this commander? No, not in a million years. But no, we're going to do it because this guy's got the better initiative, and we're going to give all his forces to this guy and subordinate this guy to him, and he'll be in charge because the math says it's better. To me, that's just, ugh. It's just the worst of everything of wargaming, in my opinion. So, nonetheless, I'm actually following this article exactly and doing all of these little force optimizations and everything because it's actually easier than trying to figure out what to do on my own. It's kind of nice to have step-by-step, cooking instructions, precise cooking instructions for a particular scenario where ordinarily I'd be looking at this and be like, yeah, I guess I'll have the French advance toward Leipzig and the Allies probably retreat towards Leipzig and have a big battle, which is funny because this article says, oh my God, this is the last thing that anyone should do on either side, which is probably what I would have done, not knowing a whole lot about this campaign prior to that. And this article pretty much starts off saying, yeah, this game demands a lot from its players. Because if you don't know anything about this campaign and you don't know the system backwards and forwards, you won't know what the hell you're doing and you will be terrible, which is, pretty much how I approach every war game, which is I don't know what the hell I'm doing and I'm going to be terrible. But here, I'm going to do it the expert way, the mathematically optimized way, the ahistorical, counterfactual nonsense way, as far as I'm concerned, and see what happens for the spring scenario. So I don't know. I may do a video just to wrap it up once I've done this, and it's about, excuse me, I think it's about 12 turns. No. Spring scenario ends, I think, here, because the D scenario starts there. So yeah. So it may just be this, so maybe 20 turns or so for the spring scenario. So I'll play through and see what happens. So far, I am following all of the optimization instructions, piling, and it's tough to, because you're swapping forces around between leaders so much. It's actually very difficult to do because you have to do all that before you move. So you gotta move guys all together. And one of the things that you can't do in the later scenario is have a bunch of stuff stacked together that can't comprise a single force. And I didn't really get that from the rules here, that apparently you can just leave stuff stacked on the map and then, at the time, decide to subordinate. The sequence of play in the later versions of the system has, at the end of every turn, you basically have to, everything that's stacked in a single space has to be consolidated into a single commander. And if it can't, then stuff has to be knocked into adjacent hexes. There's nothing like that here that I saw in the rules, so apparently you can just leave stuff stacked together and then assign forces as you need to, should, enemies move adjacent or whatever. And then if you can't consolidate everything, then it starts to split out. So there's no determined part of the turn to do that. So I just stacked a bunch of stuff up to get guys together so that at the start of next turn, I can consolidate forces, swap units around and stuff, and then start moving guys out. So right now, the Allies are essentially pulling everybody back towards Leipzig, and then we'll continue to retreat toward Dresden with cavalry blowing bridges and stuff and harrying the French advance as the French try and sweep towards Dresden. So what the French are trying to do is engage the Allies and destroy either elements of or all of their armies, whereas the Allies are attempting to preserve their armies and slow the advance of the French until the Austrians can join the fray and the army of Bohemia can come on, and then the French will be outnumbered and the Allies can start pushing back. So I may come back and do another video just seeing how the situation with the general article and the hyper optimization of the game actually worked out, and whether any of the predicted, if you do this, then this should result stuff from the article ended up happening. So we'll see how it goes.